Okay, so this lesson this video really is about your formal feedback. Most of you said that you wanted a pre-recorded version, so what I'm going to do in this video is go through common mistakes that I saw, and also how you have structured your responses. So we'll go through this first question first here. So discuss the extent to which research in psychology can be considered useful. Use evidence from relevant core studies to support your answer. So you did, as part of lesson, create a bit of a success criteria for this type of answer before we moved to remote learning, and I have got you to do a couple of these since, so we should be good at these. Okay, however, these were not executed well. Okay, so I'm just going to pull apart the question first, and then we'll start writing an answer. So the fact that it is a discuss question and it is for 12 marks suggests that you need to use four paragraphs. Okay, and generally these are going to be real paragraphs. Point, reason, evidence, explain, link. Okay, the fact it's discuss means a few things. So discuss means you need to weigh the fors and the againsts against one another. The fors and the againsts, or that could be pros or cons, or it could be weighing the strengths, weaknesses against one another. It all depends on the type of question being asked, but as this is discussed the extent to which psychology can be considered useful, it's the fors and againsts. The fact it's discuss also means you are needing to come to some kind of overall conclusion after weighing the fors and the againsts against one another. And also the fact that it is discuss means you need to talk about the impact. Okay, so if you're saying it's useful for this reason, what's the impact of that? Okay, so that's the first part of the question that I've pulled apart. The extent to which. Okay. The extent to which means you need to go beyond stating that psychology is not useful, and instead you must say how much it is useful. And that's what it means by to what extent. Okay, and finally this bit here, so use evidence from core studies to support your answer. And the fact it's saying that psychology is considered useful. Means that your paragraphs cannot be study led. Okay, so you're not saying how much a piece of research is useful, you're saying how much psychology is useful, but here's a piece of research that illustrates that point that I'm making. If you just say, here's a piece of research that's useful, this is what it's useful for, then that paragraph is counted as study-led. And if your whole answer is study-led, you are usually capped at about 3 marks for a 12 marker. Okay, so if the whole thing is study-led, you'll be capped. So it doesn't matter how much you've written, how much time you've put into it, or how much kind of knowledge of studies is in there. If it's study-led, you're only ever going to get a maximum of about 3 marks. Okay, so that's what you need to do for the structure. So common mistakes for this answer were paragraphs were study-led, saying psychology is not useful or useless. So you're not making the point that psychology is not useful, because the question is discuss the extent. So every study has some kind of use, but it might be limited in how useful it is, and that's the kind of wording that you're expected to use. So you're not saying it's not useful at all, because no research really is not useful at all, but it might be limited in how useful it is, and you definitely cannot say therefore psychology is useless, or therefore this research is useless. Okay, because it's just a really silly thing to say. Another common mistake was making points that are unrelated to usefulness and trying to make them about usefulness. Other common mistakes were things like too few points were made. Okay, so some people only made like 2 points, one in which it is useful, one in which it isn't. Therefore, you're only ever going to get a maximum of about 6 marks. And other common mistakes were in terms of structure. Such as evidence or context was not detailed enough. So, for example, some people made comment that psychology is useful because it leads on to therapies. For example, in the study of little hands, it came about that we could use psychoanalysis, and that was all you put for context. The only context in there is the words little hands. Okay, and that's just not enough. Okay, so you would have needed to elaborate a little bit on little hands and the fact that he had a phobia and what was he phobic of, and then how did we actually then cure that phobia, and therefore how does that then lead to a kind of treatment. Okay, so that was one thing in terms of structure. So evidence or context was not detailed enough, and also points were not explained or elaborated enough. Okay, so points were not explained or elaborated enough. For example, so this is the kind of the E and the E part. So most of us were able to, a lot of us missed out the link part as well, so actually linking back to the question. So quite a lot of us made a point and a reason, and then we like referenced the study very, very briefly. But then kind of there wasn't enough detail here. And there was kind of these 2 parts were missing quite a lot. So, for example, like I say, some of us said psychology is useful because it leads on to treatments. For example, it leads on to treatments because we can establish that a particular disorder has a cause, and therefore we can treat that cause. For example, in the study of little hands, we treated a disorder, and therefore psychology is useful. And that was it. Okay, so you would have needed to give more context there about what happened with little hands, like I said before, but then you would have also had to explain how that makes psychology useful, and that comes back to this bit, the extent to which it's useful, but also this bit, quite importantly, what's the impact of that? So what's the impact of us establishing what the cause of a disorder is, for example. Okay, so these were just a few of the common mistakes that were made. So pause the video just here and make sure that you have got some notes on that, and then I will go through how you should have structured that answer. Okay, so I'm gonna have a go at writing a bit of a model answer for you here. So I have come up with 4 points here that I'm going to talk about. So what I would do before you even start answering this type of question is I would very briefly just sketch out kind of, we've said it's 4 paragraphs, so I would sketch out the 4 things that I'm generally going to talk about, and then that prevents you from repeating yourselves. Another common mistake that some people did make is they would write 2 paragraphs that basically said the same thing, but just in a different structure or different order or different words, but essentially they're saying the same thing. Now you do not ever in psychology get double credited, which means if you said 2 things which are the same, so if you've basically repeated yourself, you'll get marks for the first paragraph, but you won't get marks for the second. Even if the second is better, you will not get marks for it. Okay, so yeah, just to be careful of that and to stop you from doing that, this is what I would suggest doing first. So the 4 points that I'm going to make are here. I'll just do them one by one. What I'm going to do is write them out in the structure, and you can copy it down just as a normal model answer. So what I would suggest doing is pausing after I've finished each paragraph. So listen to me writing it out, and then pause, write that paragraph down, and so on and so forth for the next 4 paragraphs. So the first point that I'm going to make is that psychology can be considered useful if it leads to treatments or interventions. Okay, so my point is going to be that psychology can be considered useful to a certain extent. Okay, so the question is discuss the extent to which. So because I've said to a certain extent already, I have done that. So psychology can be considered useful to a certain extent if it leads to treatments or interventions. Full stop. So that's my point and my reason. Evidence. Okay, so here I need to detail a case study that has led to treatments or interventions. So I can say, for example, research by Freud studied the origins of little Hans's phobia of white horses with blinkers and black around the mouth, and established that the likely reason for this was the unconscious conflict anxiety. Okay, so like I say, most people, when they were giving context, they were only kind of putting this as evidence. For example, research by Freud looking at little hands, and that was it, they were moved on. But this is kind of the level of the detail that you need to give. So here, this bit is where I would bring it back to, in general, Okay, so this bit now is going to be your explain or your elaborate part. So this is where I'm going to bring it back to that discuss question. So discuss means address the impact. So that's what I'll need to do at this point here. So we can say, therefore, psychological research which has established the roots of mental disorders has led to the development of talking therapies such as psychoanalysis, and therefore and thus has a large impact, so I've actually said the word impact, upon improving mental health conditions. Okay, so I've addressed what the impact of that is. So it's led to interventions or treatments, and therefore we're improving the mental health conditions of those who have got a mental disorder. So then it's just a link, so linking that back to the question. So we can say that overall psychology can be considered extremely useful if it creates new intervention strategies. Okay, so that is my first paragraph. So pause the video here and write that paragraph down. It's up to you whether you write it with the preamble down the side for the structure, or if you just write it as one chunky paragraph. It is completely up to you. Okay, so my next one that I'm going to talk about is this one, how research in psychology can be considered less useful if it is difficult to apply outside of a particular piece of research. So my point is that psychology can be considered less useful as research, that's my reason rather, as research limitations often mean that findings are difficult to apply outside of a piece of research. That's my point and my reason. Evidence. So I'm just going to pick a study that is difficult to apply outside of a particular piece of research. So I can say, for example, Loftus and Palmer suggested that post-event leading information in the form of a leading question can create false recall as those primed with the word or the verb smashed after watching a video of a car crash were twice as likely to falsely recall broken glass than controls. But as this a lab experiment using video footage of car crashes, it lacks ecological validity. Okay, it's also really important that you use terminology such as things like ecological validity all the way through. And then I come to my next E, so my explain. So I need to explain why research here that lacks ecological validity can be considered less useful. If psychology, again bringing it back to psychology, not just that piece of research, is based on evidence which lacks ecological validity, then the findings are difficult to apply outside of the lab setting, as if in this case participants had witnessed a real car crash, emotions such as stress would affect the recall, and then link it back. Therefore, if research in psychology is conducted artificially, then it is difficult to use this in order to explain natural behaviour. Okay, so that's your next paragraph. So again, I would just pause the video here and write that down. Okay, next paragraph. So research can be considered more useful if it adds to or changes our knowledge or understanding. So my point, psychology can be considered somewhat useful if it adds to or changes our knowledge of human behaviour. Again, that's my point and my reason. Evidence. So I can say, for example, Milgram's the Germans are different hypothesis was challenged in his research, which demonstrated that 65% of participants were obedient in establishing, no, not establishing, in administering electric shocks of 450 volts to a learner, suggesting that most people will obey moral orders given by authority. So that's my evidence. Then I need to go on to explain or elaborate. So, for example, I might say, therefore, in psychological research such as this, our understanding of human nature has changed, and the impact of this is a new view in this case we are better able to understand the events of world atrocities and potentially prevent negative consequences of psychological functions such as obedience. And then just link back. So overall, this would mean that psychology is generally useful. Again, just pause the video here and write that paragraph down. Okay, final paragraph. Research is considered less useful if it lacks generalizability. So my point, psychology can often be considered to be limited in its usefulness as research often lacks generalizability. Generalizability, that wording might be too similar to the previous paragraph that I've used here about it being difficult to apply outside of a particular situation. So what I'm going to do is go down the kind of the people route of generalizability here. So rather than the word generalizability, I'm going to talk about population validity. A piece of evidence here now. So when it comes to using evidence, mark schemes don't say that you can't use a core study twice. If you can use 4 different ones in your points, that's great. But you just need to not repeat yourself. So you can use the same study twice as long as you're going at it from a completely different angle. So I've already used Freud once, but I am going to use it again just because it's a really good illustration of a study which lacks population validity, but you can use any really. This is just one that I fancy using, but see how I'm going at it from a different angle. So we can say, for example, while Freud's research of little hands was useful in developing therapies, so I've already discussed that above, so I'm just referencing it here. We can say that he only studied little hands, one white middle class boy age 3 to 5 from Vienna, and so this sample is small and ethnocentric. Okay, then go on to explain. So my evidence there is the fact that I've said 3 to 5 from Vienna, white, middle class. Can also put he was Jewish boy. So all that information is useful there. Then I just need to explain or elaborate on how that affects usefulness. I'm going to go straight in and say the impact of using a sample which lacks population validity is that the data will not be representative of all those with a mental disorder, and therefore the treatments developed may not be useful for everyone in the target population. And then just link back. Therefore, psychological research can only be considered somewhat useful, or slightly useful, something like that. And then just finally, some kind of overall concluding comment that both references the to what extent part and that discuss come to a conclusion part. So we can say overall, psychology can be considered quite useful as though some research is limited in terms of where and who results can be generalized to, the practical applications and understanding gained from much psychological research can have a large positive impact upon society and well-being. Okay, and that's it. So don't spend the conclusion repeating the things you've already said, just kind of come to some final statement. So I'll pause the video here and write that out as a model. Okay, so the next question here was compare the social and biological approaches in psychology. Use evidence from relevant core studies to support your answer. So firstly, hints in terms of structure. So first thing in terms of structure is that you should be writing 3 paragraphs because it's 12 marks and it's a comparison question, and for comparison points you usually get roughly about 4 marks, therefore 3 times 4 is 12. So there should be 3 paragraphs. The fact it's compare means that you are talking about similarities and differences. Okay, so that's how you should generally structure it, and the way that you should do so is you should state similarity slash difference, then elaborate and evidence times 2. Okay, so that's your 4 marks. So state the similarity or difference, elaborate gets you another mark, and then 2 lots of evidence gets you the last 2 marks per paragraph. So common mistakes here. We're using 2 viewpoints. Some people just gave me 2 points. Some people gave me 1 point. You need 3. Another common mistake was poor structure. Can't type today. Yeah, so another common mistake was poor structure. So I'm not using this structure here. Another common mistake was study-led. So comparing studies. Okay, so comparing a social study to a biological study. Okay, that's not what you're being asked to do. You're asked to compare the social and biological approaches. Okay, so any in a comparison one, while in the previous question, if you wrote a study-led paragraph, your marks were capped. In this one, if you write a study-led paragraph, it's not credited. Okay, because in this one, even if it's study-led, you're still going to pick up at maybe a mark or 2 because you're still discussing a piece of research in psychology and if it's useful. So in that one, you would still pick up maybe a mark for what you've said. In this one, if you're comparing 2 studies against one another, you're completely doing a different thing to what the question is asking you. Therefore, you get 0 marks for it. So any paragraph which is comparing just 2 studies against one another gets 0 marks straight away. Okay, so that was a common mistake. And the final common mistake that people made was saying points related to assumptions. Okay, so anybody who did this, I have suggested that you go back to the lesson on similarities and differences. So if you go back on to YouTube and you search for this video, or go onto my channel and go into the Areas and Perspectives and Debates section B, paper 2 playlist, you'll find this. So basically all the way through here, this part of the video, up to about here, I talk about the things that you can and you cannot compare, and I explicitly said that you cannot compare assumptions. You must only compare things off a set list. That list is firstly in your booklets that you've been using. That list is also verbalized in the first couple of minutes of this video, and finally this sheet, which I ask you to either print out or copy out, gives you points that you can talk about, and none of them are assumptions. Okay, so if you've done that, you need to go back and watch that video. Just to remind you, the things that you can not compare: assumptions and studies. You can compare the position of the approach in a debate or issue, so you can say they're both scientific, one isn't, etc. You can compare methodological issues, so they would be things like research method, validity, reliability, type of data, ethics, the generalizability of the sample. You can compare also whether they are useful. Okay, any of those things. So pause the video here and write this down as guidance, and then we'll do a model answer. Okay, so I've come up with 3 points here. Because it's compare and it's for 12 marks, so you're providing 3 paragraphs. It doesn't have to be balanced. It's not going to be balanced because you're getting asked for 3 paragraphs. So I've done 2 similarities, 1 difference here. If it was compare even for 8 marks, where you're asked to provide 2, because it's compare, again, it doesn't have to be balanced, so you could provide 2 similarities or 2 differences. So I've come up with 3 points. Now, this is one thing that a lot of us didn't do, is actually stating in our point whether it was a similarity or difference. So a lot of us went straight into the explaining the elaborate bits and then got to our point a little bit later, or some of us didn't even get to our point at all. So one thing that's in the mark schemes for 12 mark questions is that your answers need to have like a clear and coherent argument and structure a lot of the time for 12 mark questions in general. Therefore, if you're making the examiner, because you're just describing the biological approach and describing the social approach, and you're not actually ever stating whether this is a similarity or difference, then you're basically making the examiner search for the point that you're making. And if you're doing that, then your answer isn't clear or coherent or following a certain structure. Okay, so you need to make sure you follow a structure where you are actually stating whether something is a similarity or a difference, and what that similarity or difference is straight off the bat. So for example here, I've put that one similarity is that both the biological and the social approaches can be considered to lack ecological validity. So I need to elaborate on this for the social and provide evidence of a study to back up my point, and same for the biological. So I will say that, for example, research in the biological approach often uses artificial apparatus to study biological functions so lacks generalizability, such as, I really can't type today, can I? Research. Oh no, American. Such as cases research in which go / no go tasks were conducted in an MRI scanner to evidence biological determination of impulse control. And that's all I need to put. Same for the social approach. Maybe you need to use connectives because you're saying that things are similar or they're different, so you need to use words like similarly, whereas, stuff like that. So similarly, the social approach lacks ecological validity as studies such as Milgram use controlled observations of participants undergoing unrealistic tasks such as administering electric shocks of up to 450 volts to a learner in response to an authority figure's commands. So also lacks generalizability. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video here. I will write out the other two paragraphs. So pause the video here and just write this paragraph out, and then I will write out these two for you to copy those out as well. Okay, so these are the last two paragraphs that I've just written out. So copy these down. Please just look at the level of kind of detail of context that I'm giving and the way that I'm always bringing it back to the approach. I'm not just comparing the studies. So social approach often uses controlled and standardized procedures. Here's an example of a study that does. Okay. Again here, talking about the biological approach, therefore the biological approach can also be considered scientific, so always bringing it back to that approach rather than the study. So pause the video here and copy these two out as well, please, to finish off your model answer. Okay, so this is a student answer. I'm not telling you whose answer it is, it's all anonymised. But what I'm just going to show you how to do is access your feedback. So I have returned the your answers to you. There is a mixture down the side here of both written comments and verbal comments. You can see that it's if you click on a paragraph, click on a piece of that's highlighted, it'll tell you which comment responds to it. I voice recorded some comments, as some of you have said in the past. You find it quite useful when I talk through your work with you, so that's what I'm doing here in some of your paragraphs, not necessarily all of them. There is a bit of a transcript here, but I wouldn't bother reading this because obviously it's an automated transcript and therefore it probably is likely to not make sense because I do have an accent. Therefore, you'll see when you play this one that it's not actually, that's not what I've said. So what I would do, instead of bothering to read that transcript, I won't bother with that. I would press play and I talk you through how like what you've done in your paragraphs and what's good and what's bad about him. You can reply if you want to, but what I want you to do to evidence that you have made some improvements is I want you to pick a different coloured pen. So you might pick like a blue pen. And make improvements. So anywhere where you change your answer in relation to the feedback I've given you, I want you to change to a different coloured pen, make improvements, and then just return it to me. I'm not going to mark them again, but return it to me so that I can see that you have made those improvements.